Hello, how are you going? How was your session? All good? Yeah. Hand over that at some stage, or were you? It's always a treat to. Good morning, everybody. We might just take our seats. We're about to start. Good morning, everybody. Please take your seats. We're about to start our session today, and I'm not going to make that old joke about standing between you and the buffet, but I am cognizant that time is of the essence. So welcome, everybody, to this session about homeless in regional Australia. My name is John Engler, and I'm the CEO of Shelter New South Wales and the Chair of National Shelter. And it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome you here today to this particular session. I'm very excited about our four speakers that we'll be presenting to you today. Most importantly is that we get the opportunity to really ask questions. It's a dynamic session, so they'll present and then we get to ask them questions, and some tricky ones I hope as well. I would like to start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and I certainly pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And as is the case with Shelter, we always like to acknowledge that this land never was ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. With that in mind, just a couple of opening remarks before we get on. I was particularly excited to be in the room yesterday with our new Minister for Housing and for Homelessness, and that Minister has a position in the Cabinet. I think that's not worth that's worth repeating many times. We're fortunate indeed to be in an industry, local, state, federal level, where we have national backing increasingly about this sector. couple of other things today. I think, again, it's important to acknowledge, and I very much appreciate the work that both ACHIA, so Michael and his team, and Homelessness Australia, so Jenny and the team, this is the second time that they've courted danger in terms of having an event that's nearly been a bit derailed by the possibilities of COVID. But to their credit, both in Melbourne at the Homelessness Conference in March and here, they've pulled it off, so congratulations to them. And in that, they've delivered for us, and will today, so I'm saying hello in particular to our nearly 300 people who are watching online. So welcome to all of them, doing a great job to be able to have both a hybrid, so here in person and our people online. So I especially encourage all of you, I'm looking down the camera now, all of you who are online watching, we need you to ask the questions as well. We'd like you to feel as if you're in the room with us, here with us today. It's certainly a packed room. So 4 speakers that we have. First of all, we'll begin with the program's slightly different, but it is important that we start with Lisa Sampson. Lisa Sampson is the CEO of the Aboriginal Community Housing Industry Association. We've had discussions, and as part of the preparation for this session, we all agreed that I think it's time that we stop sort of adding these things onto the end. It's important that we begin with Aboriginal housing as a central issue, particularly as it relates to regional housing. Secondly, we'll be hearing from Adam Liversage, who's the Senior Manager of Homelessness at Uniting at Ballarat. That work that he carries out also includes Barwon, the Western Districts of Victoria. He'll be talking about some homelessness to home and some other programs and some examples of what they're doing and how they're really making some gains in particular areas. Trudi Ray's the Deputy CEO and the Chief Operating Officer of Haven Home Safe. She mainly will be focusing, I think, and talking to us about, say, Geelong, an area that they're very strong in, a huge growing area and emblematic of the regional housing shift that we've seen through COVID. We could say it was because of COVID or fires or floods, but these trends and push to regional areas predates these recent events. They've been exacerbated and sped up. And I know Trudi will touch on that. And that leads me then to Kim Houghton. So Kim Houghton is the Chief Economist for the Regional Australia Institute, and we've worked with Kim. I know that the Regional Australia Institute has increasingly been concerned with housing and homelessness as an issue. They've seen that as a particular area of focus, and certainly Kim is renowned for saying things like, particularly in New South Wales, there's a bit of a sandstone divide, and we've got a whole lot of possibilities in Western New South Wales where there might be plenty of houses but not particularly many jobs, or east of the divide where there might be plenty of jobs but not much housing. So when we talk about regional housing, it's important to link it back in, and Kim will certainly do that, with the bigger macro picture, the growth, the infrastructure, what's happening. And on a bit of a note, and I'm hoping some questions come out about this, there are some challenges for all of us. I think the business as usual approach has had its day. COVID has taught us that things can get turned on the head. We heard yesterday from a number of state bodies about how quickly they were able to respond to emergency issues when it comes to street sleeping or homelessness and interacting with the hotel sector. So I'm very much looking forward to not just describing what all the problems are, but what are some of the solutions that we can take away. It would be great if through our questions and questions of both the individual panel members and together as a group, nutting out some really good takeaway solutions that we can have, that we can say, I learnt about that at the conference. So without any further ado, I welcome our first speaker, and it is rightly so that it is Lisa Sampson, the CEO of the Aboriginal Community Housing Industry Association. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. Once again, I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which we're meeting here today, and also Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging, and also thank you and welcome to all Aboriginal people in the room. Thanks for having us here today. I just wanted to reflect before we go too far on the space in which we're meeting today as it currently stands, as it's currently built. I'd like to reflect on the fact that for the plenary session earlier, we were in the Royal Theatre. We had a welcome to country in the Royal Theatre, and we spoke about Close the Gap in the Royal Theatre. We're now in the Menzies Theatrette. The Menzies government, clearly one of the most long-standing prime ministers with the longest tenure in modern Australian history, and of course the government that was responsible for the setting up of IATSIS, or what was the forerunner of IATSIS. So some runs on the board, but also some fairly divisive policies that were seen and acted upon Aboriginal people, and reflecting on what Shane Hamilton, the new Deputy Secretary of Aboriginal Affairs New South Wales, was saying this morning in terms of our history of colonisation and the effects of dispossession that flowed on from that. Of course, we are still dealing with this today, and the impediments upon building multi-generation or intergenerational wealth, as well as knowledge and opportunity for ongoing generations of Aboriginal people, certainly been quite stymied by the way in which modern Australia has developed over the last 245 odd years. But onto the business in hand, and I wanted to reflect on the fact that the Aboriginal Community Housing Industry Association, we're quite a new peak body. We were incorporated in November of 2020, so we've in fact only been operating for just under 2 years. And in that period of time, we have, as a result of the management committee that then became our board, all Aboriginal controlled, august elders who have worked in housing in New South Wales for 30, 40, 50 and 60 years. So these people have been the people who have collectively directed the formation of our peak body, and what they then jumped into as a result of the start of COVID and the continuation of the crisis that we've been in over the last 2+ years has been, what is the response that is going to what is the response that government, community, industry and Aboriginal community housing providers and homelessness providers had to COVID? Well, in terms of the response overall to COVID, I would have to share with you here today our overall deep and abiding disappointment. Now, it's fine for government departments, and many of which we work with and that we absolutely hold in high esteem, but the kind of responses that were put in place for everyday Australians to do with COVID, and I know that it was a crisis for everyone, not just Aboriginal community housing providers and homelessness providers, but as that response, as patchy as it was, as concerning as it was, as as stretched an emergency as it was, as that was rolling out across mainstream Australian society, what happened in New South Wales to Aboriginal community housing providers, and we have 170 of them in New South Wales. We have 4 specialist Aboriginal specialist homelessness services in New South Wales. The 4 Aboriginal specialist homelessness services in New South Wales were treated alongside all of the rest of the specialist homelessness providers in New South Wales. So that was one thing. The 170 Aboriginal community housing providers, with the 5,000 plus Aboriginal families that they service across New South Wales, what happened to them? There was no response to COVID. They were left to be able to make their own response. What did they do? They absolutely banded together in terms of the organising principles of their community, their law, their elders, and absolutely banded together. But there was no response. And so what we as a peak body then ended up doing was putting out our own COVID guidance in the absence of any guidance from a government department and from any of our other partners. Now, there is not a standard way of responding across the integrated community and human services sector. And oftentimes Aboriginal people and communities and their families are viewed as an add-on. offer that we can make to our collective futures, not just as Australians, but as a planet. So look, I'll leave you with those reflections on what our entree into COVID has been as the Aboriginal community housing provider sector, and certainly throughout the discussion with the panel members today, would happily answer any questions and share with you other reflections as we go forward about regional New South Wales. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll just double check. So we do have an opportunity to ask a few questions now. I'll just check with Tom. Have we got any from online just yet? That's good. Would somebody here in the audience like to ask a question of Lisa? And I can assure you with these conferences, there's no such thing as a dumb question. These guys are big and brave. They're happy to take questions, including curly ones, because if you're thinking it, chances are somebody else is as well. So would anyone like to ask Lisa a question before we move on to Adam's session? Yes. That's fine. With you. Oh, sorry, there is a microphone. My fault. Thanks, Lisa.
Considering this topic is around homelessness in regional Australia, and the rates of homelessness are that much higher in Indigenous, remote and very remote communities, up to 50 times higher, do you think as a sector that we're putting a proportional amount of effort into resolving and focusing in on the disproportionate rate of homelessness even amongst Aboriginal people in Australia?
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that question.
Can we?
Once again, I think that there is an investment, but that investment does not keep pace with the scale at which the problem continues to grow. And also, as a point that was made in the earlier plenary session, homelessness to Aboriginal communities and their families means something different oftentimes. You go back to country to attend a funeral and you're staying, with family members in a house. This does not mean that it's overcrowded, nor does it mean that people are homeless. If you go back after being incarcerated and go back to stay with someone, that does not mean you're homeless. It means that you may not have a permanent place to live, but is that family and the home in which you're staying viewed by you as your home? Yes, it is. So these are the kinds of considerations, the cultural considerations that need to be the forefront of what happens when we're planning for growing in regional New South Wales. Of course, I just, the Aboriginal Community Housing and Industry Innovation Fund, or ACHIA, has rolled out across New South Wales. There have been a couple of rounds of that. There are rounds of building new, larger homes for Aboriginal families in regional areas. And that's what I have to say in New South Wales. We probably invest quite a bit in larger family homes. Still not at the pace that we need to invest, but we do. But this is still government investment. At this stage, there has not been a single NIFIC social housing bond release that has funded a single Aboriginal community housing provider. When Aboriginal community housing providers sit on 39% of the Australian land mass, and that is a massive under-leveraged land asset, why are we seeing this? There must be institutional barriers if those are the kinds of things we're dealing with. So yes, it is a problem of regional investment, but it's also a problem of supporting the 170 in New South Wales Aboriginal community housing providers who collectively sit on a significant number of assets to be able to actually move forward and build a pipeline of social and affordable housing properties, as well as as across the continuum.
Thank you, Lisa. Anyone else? We've got time for one more question before we get Adam's session. If anyone's got a question. Tom, is there anyone online who's got a question for us? No. I might ask a quick question then, Lisa. We know that severe overcrowding is, if you like, we often, when we talk about the 116,000 people that are every census, we're told is the net number of people who are homeless. Severe overcrowding is often not given probably the attention it's needed. We focus more on the overt end of rough sleeping and people in boarding houses, couch surfing. how do we make sure that we don't overplay the cultural aspects of severe overcrowding? Exactly what we were saying about people choosing to live in large numbers for particular periods, because often we're told that severe overcrowding as an aspect of homelessness can be explained away as a cultural preference. Have you got anything to say about that at all?
I think there needs to be a lot more discussion and consultation with individual Aboriginal communities. That is the real factor that is missing. The Aboriginal Housing Office in New South Wales runs regional Aboriginal housing committees. Those function, spasmodically over time, renew themselves over time, but how does that then feed through to the other consultation and innovation and service development mechanisms in the state? Those are the questions we need to ask, because if the ecosystem is to function well, we have to have Lego bricks that intersect, not just things that hang in space like those 1960s mosquito tapes in a door flapping around in the wind. We need to really find what homelessness actually means to individual Aboriginal communities, but we also need to find out, if we're talking about regional New South Wales, it's not just larger family homes either. Are there a collection of different housing solutions, and what flexible housing solutions can be utilised and then deployed and redeployed in order to meet the needs of communities, if in fact we have an ability to look at a collective set of housing stock and that is both fixed and movable?
Thank you, Lisa. Good. We might move on then. If you just would join with me in thanking Lisa for that presentation. Now, I hope I've got this right for you, Adam. Oh, thanks. It's the Uniting one. So Adam comes to us as the General Manager of Homelessness Services for Uniting in Ballarat and Barwon in the Western Districts of Victoria. But as he was explaining to me earlier today, it often involves long distances of driving to Houghton as well. So Adam's going to talk to us about some particular things they've been able to do in Victoria, in his neck of the woods, and especially a homelessness to home program, which has been quite successful. So we look forward to hearing more about that in his slides. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks, John, and thanks for having me here today, everyone. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional lands on which we're on today, the Ngunnawal peoples, and certainly pay my respects to those past, present, and emerging. So, good morning. So as John said, I'm Adam Liversage, the Senior Manager of Homelessness at Uniting Ballarat. But as you can see by the map there, over to the far left in orange, cover quite a large area. So those that don't know regional Victoria, Ballarat, Stawell, Ararat, Horsham, and we also deliver homelessness to a home out in Hamilton and Warrnambool. So on any given day, our workers can travel anywhere from 450 k's to 550 kilometres. So it's so we do get a lot of time away, a lot of nights in hotels. So Uniting do run the run-of-the-mill housing and homelessness programs in these areas, our entry points, our street to home programs, our assertive outreach, our supportive housing teams, and obviously our entry points and homelessness to a home as well. Some of the issues that we're facing at the moment, obviously in regional Victoria, is obviously the squeeze in the rental market, particularly in Ballarat and Warrnambool. As you can see in Ballarat there, since 2019, the median rent has actually increased from $370 to $419 now, and which means that's the new affordable lettings is at its lowest for 3 years. We've got a vacancy rate of 0.9%, and last week was National Homelessness Week, and we had a representative from a local real estate agent who said they had 500 rentals in Ballarat and surrounds and one property available to rent. So it's a real squeeze at the moment. And also we have a 0.4% affordability rate in Ballarat and or Central Highlands. Over to Warrnambool. Well, it was an interesting one as well, and we're very lucky that we did manage to get some homelessness to home packages down there. For a population of 35,500, it's a similar trend to Ballarat, but it's increasing a lot quicker down in Warrnambool in those particular areas. At the moment, it's $420 per week, and there's only 151 properties available out of that population of 35,500. So their vacancy rate at the moment is sitting at 0.4%. So you can sort of see that the trends in those areas, Horsham is similar, Ballarat, Warrnambool, it's a real battle out there. You know, if they do access the rental market, then you are looking at the affordability, putting food on the table, supporting your kids, getting your kids in education. And as a result, we are seeing an increase of people presenting to our entry points and our services right across these regional areas as a result. What the cram in here? So homelessness to a home, we heard it a lot about homelessness to a home yesterday. It was 1,845 packages across the state of Victoria. To people experiencing homelessness who are residing in emergency accommodation due to COVID-19. It was one of those programs where we're told that this commenced 5 weeks ago, and we need to get together and obviously look at 75 packages right across Ballarat, the Wimmera, and down the southwest in Warrnambool there. So it was a real battle to get that across those three regions. We had 1,300 people who were eligible for homelessness to a home, 75 packages. So we got 4% of the packages right across those three regions. So it was a real battle getting together with the Hearts and nominating consumers into these properties, but to be able to have an influence, we're over 1,200 people we had to say no to that didn't get an opportunity to move into long-term housing. So for welfare agencies like Uniting, Salvation Army, Brophy, Nehemiah, it was real sad, and it was hard on the workers as well because they were plugging for their consumers, their clients, really putting a good case forward to why their clients should get long-term housing and support, and to have to say no time and time again to over 1,200 people was a really difficult time. So I've touched on some of that. I think we'll probably move on because I know we are getting short of time today. So the long-term goals that were consumer identified in homelessness to a home, was employment and education, address mental health and alcohol and other drug misuse, live a fulfilling life, stable housing and sustained tenancies, complete community correction orders, attain an income. We found a lot of consumers that did go into homelessness to a home that were residing in hotels and motels actually didn't have an income. Also raising families, family reunification as well was a big one. We did find that once consumers did move into their long-term housing, that they were able to get their children back into their care as well. So that was really exciting. And I think we've also had 9 babies born into homelessness to a home as well over the last 12 months. So that's been great as well. So attaining driver's license and obviously health and fitness. So what did we learn from homelessness to a home? So collaboration, that we can all work together and to solve homelessness. Community services have the knowledge and capacity to respond when called upon. We know that. Throughout COVID-19, we found the state and the federal governments can work together to form and plan a response. It wasn't around homelessness, but it did prove that they actually can work together. So why can't this be done to solve homelessness, and why did it take a pandemic to achieve this? Successful outcomes, once people are housed, successful outcomes are a reality. A well-funded resource program allows for maximum opportunity and successful outcomes. The housing first model really works, so I don't need to elaborate on that too much. The community services sector response and also H2H in regional was very successful. We've had minimal housing breakdowns and issues. Once again, proof that wraparound support and available resources, really does help sustain tenancies. And there's just a couple of quotes there. I think it's always nice to see the consumer voice, the consumer feedback, especially on programs like this. And we've got stable housing. Since I moved in here, I've been able to get myself a job, and I'm able to live, not just survive. I finally got to experience independence, and finally got to tell my mum, hey, look, I got a house. And when I looked at the stats last week, we've had 11 people gain employment and 9 have gone into education. So, really fantastic outcomes as a part of H2H. So moving on to something totally different here. So what are we doing also in regional Victoria? It's not just all about the housing and the agencies and the bricks and mortar and everything else. our Street to Home team, which I'm really, really proud of, have just recently employed a peer support worker. His name is Jeremy. So Jeremy was sleeping rough for 18 months in the bush, 15 minutes out of Ballarat. He got his long-term housing offer about 12 months ago, really engaging. He has since been employed as our peer support worker. He's got a scholarship through Federation University. He's currently completing his diploma in community services and absolutely doing a cracking job. And I think with peer support workers, every funded homelessness program should have a peer support worker. You know, you can't really, you know, their impact that they have on the programs, the consumers, the connection, everything else is absolutely fantastic. Trying to get through all this, John, my apologies. So also want to introduce the HARC. So this is our Homelessness Advocacy Reference Committee, so HARC, which also sits with our Street to Home team. So the HARC was a project that Street to Home developed in honour of a client that worked with Street to Home who sadly passed away after securing and establishing her long-term housing. Street to Home identified the client's experienced loneliness and lack of purposeful and meaningful engagement following secure long-term housing. And it wasn't just this consumer in Street to Home. You know, we do find that when a lot of rough sleepers do get into long-term housing, they do become isolated, and we do tend to experience a lot of suicides and overdoses as well. So it's really, really sad. HARC is a reference committee operated by 10 current and previous clients of the Street to Home program at Uniting Ballarat. So HARC does engage the consumer voice. It provides homelessness focused and initiated consultation. Consumer partners are remunerated, so they actually are paid. They're paid $40 per session, and consumers express their feelings. So this is a picture of Jeremy. So this is our peer support worker. You can see how happy he is there, and he speaks really proudly of Uniting and the work that he does. He's very, very heavily involved in the media as well, and really promotes homelessness and issues around homelessness. And I think it's really important to see the quote there that Jeremy's put there, that I feel as HARC has provided space for our consumers to have a real voice on the issues, big and small. I also feel that HARC is an extraordinary opportunity to give a real sense of purpose to all our members. At this early stage, the buy-in is amazing and the enthusiasm is infectious. And I think it's really important to see those quotes and the importance that it actually means to these consumers that we have. And also, as a part of our Street to Home program, and it's good to do something different today, isn't it? We're very heavily involved in community engagement as well, and this is also through our Street to Home team. So our community engagement program is our art group there. So everyone in that photo has been rough sleeping and now in their long-term housing. So they love their art. They all get together. You can see the smiles. And last week was National Homelessness Week. In Ballarat, we did, it was all about consumer voice, consumer focus, and they actually did an art exhibition that ran the whole entire week, and I think we had about 400 to 500 people come through our doors last week and read their stories, see their artwork, see their photos. It was fantastic, and once again, Beck, who's done the quote there that, you need friendship, it's important, I'm trying to get more out. I'm not so lonely and bored in my house, I'm part of an art group, which has been great to do something creative, but also to be with other people. I'd say happiness is starting to take over now instead of trauma and sadness. And this is Ange, and just to finish off, so Ange is our mental health worker in Street to Home, who does all the community engagement activities. And I'm quite happy to hand over to you, John, while people read that quote from Ange. But we are doing something different at Uniting, and we do find that these community engagement activities, peer support workers, really do sustain tenancies. If we didn't have them, the tenancies do tend to break down, so they do need that other element of support. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. And the joys of having these little devices means that we can check things while these things are going on. I've just looked up the word, the meaning of HARC, which means to pay very close attention. So I think that program is particularly well named. Well done, Adam. We've got a couple of questions. So just one or two for Adam, and then we'll move on to our next speaker, Trudi. So one's come from Grace B online. So thanks, Grace, for your question. What has been the retention rate of clients assisted in the H2H, and where do you think that there are still gaps and learnings to build upon, Adam?
Yes, so far in in the Homelessness to Home program. We do have a 96% tenancy success rate at the moment. It's a really engaging program, and that's probably one of the best things about regional Victoria is that we all do work quite closely together. It's a tight-knitted community as well. A homelessness community all tend to know each other. We do have 3 meals programs also in Ballarat, where there's a lot of social engagement as well. So I hope that answers the question. There was a couple of parts to that.
Excellent, very good. I've got another question. It's like a tri-bid question. We've actually got a question from somebody here in the room. So 500 rental properties available, 500 rental properties, only one is suitable. How many short-term rentals does this agent have available? So in other words, what's been the impact that you've seen of short-term rental, Airbnb, the changes? What have you seen?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting question, and it's right across the board. The rental market, or the squeeze of the rental market, particularly in Ballarat, is really serious at the moment. We talk about that one particular property, and I was quite shocked. The Airbnbs, they're not accessible to our consumers. Over COVID, we did have those opportunities to rent Airbnbs and things like that. But Ballarat, as we know, is a big tourist town, and now we've sort of come out of COVID-19 and people are starting to come back up to our regional areas. We just don't get a look in anymore.
All right, any other questions from the floor? That was Digby. Thanks for that question, Digby. Any other questions from the floor? Anyone? Yep. A microphone will come to you and then we'll move on. We'll hear from Trudi.
You talked about workers having to go 450 to 500 and something kilometres a day, and long distances between. What kind of suggestions or strategies might be useful to kind of build efficiencies, or be able to continue that intense support that's so needed, but obviously make it so there's not that time and it's being more efficient and effective?
Yeah, absolutely. When we first had Homelessness to a Home up in Houghton there, we actually advertised for 2 full-time case managers as part of that program. We didn't get one single application. We advertised 2 or 3 times over and still no luck. We did get a few applicants from Melbourne who were just putting applications in just for the sake of putting applications in, and they thought Houghton was a suburb of eastern Melbourne. So what we've done, it's done the right thing. We've actually streamlined our services and our streams, and we do have a homelessness stream now. So, we do have weekly meetings as well with all our homelessness staff, and, we all bounce off each other. We've streamlined our processes, we've streamlined our practices, but we also call on each other to back each other in and provide that support where another support worker might not be able to do so. We've got a rotational system as well because Ballarat unfortunately has to provide the support for Homelessness to a Home in Horsham, so they do have to travel at 220k to Horsham and back. So we do put them on a rotation. So we've got 6 staff, so we might send 2 staff one week, then 2 staff the week after. And even myself, when I go up to Horsham as well, I'll grab one of the workers from that particular office and I'll even go out and do some visits as well and say hello to some of the consumers. So it is a battle, but we just make the best of a bad situation. And in areas that we really can't get to, like Hamilton, which is, again, another hour and a half on west of Horsham there, we do work in the consortium with Salvation Army and they do cover parts of that program for us out there because we just can't get to it.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to Trudi. Adam, thank you very much. Would you all join me in thanking Adam for that fantastic session all about regional? We now have Trudi Ray, who is the Deputy CEO and Chief Operating Officer for Haven Home Safe. I know that Trudy's going to talk particularly about Geelong, and I think her presentation especially will touch on equally about strains on employment. We can't separate the workforce requirements. We've all heard about that, and indeed there are some other sessions at this conference that specifically focus on that. But the idea of Geelong in particular is a part of Melbourne, I think fastest growing region in Australia. I know Trudi will talk about that, so welcome Trudi.
Great, thank you. Make sure that doesn't fall. Great, thank you, and great to be. Not sure what's happening, and just like to pay my respects to any elders past, present and future that may be here today on country. And thank you all very much for your interest. Regional Australia, but particularly regional Victoria, is something I'm incredibly passionate about. So to be able to share some of the stories that we've been featuring of the last couple of years in particular is really great. So who is Haven Home Safe? So Haven Home Safe is a homeless organisation that provides housing solutions. We are an organisation that is rooted in Bendigo in Victoria, but also has offices from Preston in Geelong through to Mildura, Swan Hill, Echuca, Kai Abram. So we do majority of Victoria, and like Adam, travel quite some distances. I go to Mildura quite often, and it takes 7 hours to get there just to go meet the team up there. We get over 20,000 calls for help a year, and what that means is that we have, with our community housing part of our business, we have 3,000 dwellings in which we can only satisfy a number of applications and allocations as we go through that year. Our tenancies are at about a 98% occupancy rate, which tells us that whilst we have 20,000 calls a year, many of those people will not be able to get into the housing in which we provide. We have 3 access points, so we do initial assessment and planning across both Preston, Geelong and Mildura, and that's where those 20,000 calls are coming into. But in terms of the diversity and nuance of regional Victoria, and Adam certainly touched on what that looks like, but what we have seen over the last 2 years has been quite exceptional. And reflecting on the conversation yesterday was really quite interesting, because as I said to the Deputy Premier of Victoria not so long ago, never have we had that much money but nowhere to actually spend it. And the issue with that is that, yes, there was hotels, there were people that we could have certainly helped in terms of the tourist economy, but it was a problem in the sense of we couldn't get people into the accommodation. There was a lot of places within regional Victoria that still wouldn't house homeless clients for all the reasons that we know. So we had an incredibly difficult time trying to spend the money. We too have Homeless to Homes program, in which we have 187 packages across Loddon, Mallee and the Barwon Southwest region. I'm happy to say that we have 100% sustainability in all tenancies across that field, and in Geelong particularly, the landlords and the real estate agents were coming to us and still continue to come with us with, we have houses, do you need them, So that's a really great position to be in terms of that particular area. However, the rental cost increases in regional Victoria have gone up 10.8% in the last 12 months alone. That is compared to June 21, and 23% in the last 2 years. And in the capital, that's gone up 9.1%. Population growth rates have increased, particularly in regional Victoria, with a 200% increase of migration from the capital cities into regional Victoria. So what we know in that, in terms of our low vacancy rate, so it's currently sitting, whether you're in Bendigo, it's currently at 0.9, Geelong is 1.2, but certainly what we're seeing is an increasing pressure on the rental markets. We're seeing underutilisation of all homes across regional Victoria, and that migration, because of the working from home economy, has now seen a lot of these houses that are full on the weekends for the weekenders, for the city folk, but certainly vacant through the week. What we also know is in places like the Wimmera, and I'm going to mention Horsham again, it's never featured so strongly, and I'm from there, so that's pretty exciting. But in the Wimmera, the percentage of rented houses where the landlord is the tenant's employer is more than triple the state average. So businesses are having to buy property for their key workers to keep them not only employed, but certainly sustain their housing. We, as I said, unoccupied houses in towns you wouldn't expect. So in Yarra and Biak Shire, which is, for those that don't know, it's Warwick, Nabil, Woolmalang, it's very rural. There's 680 unoccupied dwellings, but the majority of them are not for sale. So they're vacant, they're there to be lived in, but certainly, not a place that you'd have an Airbnb necessarily. But the underinvestment in housing is about playing catch up. And yes, we have the big housing build in Victoria, and when it first got announced, we were all the fire hydrant opportunity. It's all flooding. $5.8 billion of big housing build investment. 25% of that has to be spent in regional Victoria. It's incredibly exciting. However, with all the other nuances of the construction industry, the price inflation, the escalation, and the requirement to deliver 12,000 properties in an environment that continually escalates in terms of cost pressures, the ability to get trades, particularly in regional Victoria, we are not going to see a lot of those houses come to fruition for some time, and that is obviously of a concern. We have pressures on the affordable and key worker housing, and an example is in Bendigo currently we have about 25 people living out in a park in Huntley, where, yes, they're rough sleeping, but all of them are employed. So they all have jobs, and every night they go home to this park, and they live either in tents or they've got their caravans or cars out there. And it's, a Bendigo outrage. How come these people don't have anywhere to stay? And we continually ask those questions. And certainly it's the pressure on the housing market in those particular areas, and particularly now tourism. I mean, Bendigo just had the Elvis exhibition, and there was not one hotel vacancy for over 4 months. Last year, we saw 1,580 new clients requesting support for the very first time. And what we're seeing is 2,093 people have required emergency accommodation, which was up from 600 the year before. We provide over 3,500 food vouchers, and we know that 1 in 4 families, regardless of their socioeconomic status, coming to us are now accepting food relief. 1 in 30 young people in Victoria aged between 15 and 19 experienced first-time homelessness during the pandemic. Nationally, twice as many women and girls experienced first-time homelessness in 2021 compared to men. 5,060 young people presenting as homeless in Victoria were unable to be housed due to the lack of supply. Reasons, obviously, for presenting is financial difficulties, but it's certainly around when vacancy rates go below 2%, it's a landlord's market. When it's at 3%, it's balanced. But above 3, it's a tenant's joy, because it's choice, and they have choice in the marketplace. And we're currently sitting at 0.9% in regional Victoria. So the people we serve, our teams see an increasing demand, as we know, but we're also seeing an increase of help from the following cohorts. Single people impacted by huge rental increases, single people and single mothers on Centrelink incomes. COVID was absolutely the tipping point, and it certainly exacerbated the requirements in Victoria. And I see some of my Victorian colleagues here today, and never have we experienced so much cash. We were so flush with cash, but the issue was, how do we spend it? How can we actually, particularly in Bendigo, where we have the Homeless to Homes program, and unfortunately some of those people, even that had gone through the allocation process, had been successful in being the ones that could finally get a house. There were no houses available. So for the 50 families that we could have housed in the H2H program, we unfortunately, there was no private rental available for those people. So we've had to move them out of area. They've had to go to our Barwon program, so they're now living in Geelong or in Melbourne, because that's the only way we could house them, which is taking people out of area, which is not certainly what we want to do. So just on to Geelong now. So Geelong is where I live, and it's a fabulous place, but it's also got the fastest growing population, increasing private rental costs, and a lack of affordable rents. In the news a couple of weeks ago, it was all very exciting because the median house price in Geelong is now $1 million. So great for those that actually own homes. And again, we talk about generational wealth, but certainly it's also got a lack of affordable rentals and the second highest rate of family violence in the country. It's the 4th highest capital regional migration at 4% in 2021. Geelong has the 2nd highest need for social and affordable housing in regional Victoria, and will need over 10,000 properties to keep up with the current demand. The lack of affordable and rental availability, so on average 1,188 rentals available at an average of $475 a week. We have now one of the biggest prison systems, with all the prisons getting built outside of Geelong, and the lack of options that we have for people leaving care is certainly reduced. The rental stress in the Corangamite ward is 38.4%, and in the Corio ward, which is absolutely chock-a-block full of social and affordable housing, is at 61.3%. So we have the higher than median house prices than now metropolitan Melbourne. So it's a really massive challenge for us there. Sector challenges, the supply issues. So obviously we've heard this morning about the big housing build and certainly around the need for more housing. Currently the big housing build will deliver probably 12,000 homes. We need to build about 30,000 just to keep up with the current demand that we're seeing. Cost of builds are absolutely increasing, means less bang for buck. We are calling on the state government to order underutilised land in regional Victoria, invest in early works to create pipeline opportunity around portfolio-based funding. We also, the Commonwealth Games just finished, and yes, it's going to be in Victoria, but for 2 weeks of competition is 40 years left of housing stock. So we need to make sure the government delivers an investment that can be really well used and utilised into the future. We need solutions now for the 65,000 people that are currently on the Victorian housing waiting list. We have used, so we have 1,200 homes in which our tenants, our rental collections around $18 million a year. In the change to the RTA, the ATO and all the tax changes that we've seen, what we used to earn in rent has gone down $1 million in 12 months. So we are, as community housing organisations, we are also seeing the impacts of government intervention into delivering more homes for the people that we know we need to house. The issue with that is the people that are trying to do the work on the ground are also getting the hit. So we have a real issue here in terms of how can government intervention take away our sovereignty, which means that we are always trying to find new ways to be innovative. How do we work beyond the government bounds? And as I say, the $5.8 billion is great. We're very excited for that. But how can we actually deliver more housing beyond government? And what is next after the big housing build? So we're all about innovating and adapting and evolving because you have to in this sector. It's a constant change. We believe there's a lot of stagnant policy that needs to have multi-layered collaboration in order to solve some of these issues. So unlocking land supply, working on the 1 million properties that are currently in Airbnb across regional Victoria, in the Surf Coast and across Bendigo and Ballarat and the Wimmera and Geelong. And certainly how can we have tax incentives that make those houses available to the people that actually need to use them. We're very excited about the Housing Australia Future Fund, and that $10 billion delivering 30,000 new housing over 5 years is incredibly going to be great. But again, how is the federal government going to liaise with the states to ensure that the states aren't clipping the ticket too much on the way through so that we actually get the housing on the ground? There's enormous workforce challenges, there's enormous surge in demand, and we've seen many homelessness services overwhelmed for calls of assistance. Majority of our complaints at the moment is that people cannot get through. They can't get through our services, whether it's through the phones, through the website. It's a real concern, but with 20,000 calls for help over 3 access points, you can see the issues there. So many services have had to force to turn on their voicemails. We constantly try and work through how we can work better with our partners in terms of having an integrated service response, but certainly it is very much an issue. Yeah, sure. But yeah, it's really about what are our existing partnerships, and the Homeless to Homes program, as Adam spoke about, was one of the most innovative and evolving programs we've ever been part of. It certainly has ensured that people who are homeless can actually be housed and they can sustain their tenancies. As I said, 100% of our clients in Geelong have sustained their tenancies. And these are people who have not lived in homes for 17, 20, 30 years, street-based homeless people. And by providing that housing first wraparound, tailored, integrated, high intensity support, we are seeing some incredible results. We are also partnering with Dja Dja Wurrung clans and the Aboriginal Corporation and Mallee District Aboriginal Services to develop and implement the long-term and social affordable housing strategies to meet the needs of First Peoples across both the Jara and MDAS communities, which is in Bendigo, Loddon Mallee and up through Mildura. And Jenny Sams talked about first principles and the framework in which we're trying to deliver under the big housing build. And we're continuing to develop our partnerships with those communities in a way to be able to help them and ACHIAs build and develop on the land in which they belong. So we have a lot of aspirations and a lot of work to do in those areas, and we need to get the outcomes and the values beyond the built form as we move through. So partnering with many different partners and certainly organisations across the areas in which we are, because we know we can't do it together. The Department of Families provide 900 different agencies with funding to deliver on homeless services in Victoria. I think we can be doing better with those 900 services. I think we can all complement each other better if we weren't set up to compete with one another and have a much more integrated service offering. But I think I'll leave it there. But thank you very much for your interest.
Thanks so much, Trudi. That's fantastic. And I know it was important to hear about the workforce issues as well. We're talking about, in order to provide services for the homelessness services, that was extraordinary, the number of employers that have to actually provide accommodation for their staff to ensure those services are provided. I'll just see if there's any questions from Tom. We've got a specific one for Trudi, and then we'll introduce Kim so we can move on with some questions. So we've got a question from Alea, who's online. So this is for you, Trudi. So with regard to Huntley Rest Stop, are HHS, I think sometimes we all need to have a CAO, a Chief Acronyms Officer, are HHS assisting in the linking the families out there into housing, seeing as the Bendigo Council is evicting them from rest stops? So something to do with local council, particularly Bendigo. Have you got anything on that, Trudi?
Yes, I do. Yeah, really interesting environment. So it is currently registered as a campground. So these people are absolutely able to stay there. However, the council hasn't liked that. So they've put in a request to DWELP to have the land rezoned to non-camping grounds. And now they're making it a Haven Home Safe response in terms of how do we help house these people that are out there. Really important. The majority of people that are actually out there are not service users of Haven Home Safe. We have obviously got our Rough Sleeper Action program going out there through our Hayvan, and we offer services. However, we can't force people to take our services. And again, the emergency accommodation in Bendigo is so very hard to get into. A 3-day respite, they're going to move and lose their camping spot that they currently have. So what's really important to us is how do we engage with them differently, not put our own judgment and biases on why people stay in camping grounds, but certainly, yes, we're providing that care and that help, but they are also employed. So I think as a community, what can we be doing with their employers and also the local real estate agents and the council to get a better outcome there?
Thank you. We'll move on to Kim. Thanks for that, Trudi. Interesting that local councils are one of the questions that we'd pose to our particular panel, and we'll get to this. You know, are they friend or foe when it comes to these things? That sounds to me like something worth investigating through some questions. I'll just get the IT to come down while I introduce Dr. Kim Houghton again to you. So Kim is the Regional Australia Institute Chief Economist, and I know from Shelter's point of view, we very much valued the particular work that they did for us about regional housing issues. And just by way of an aside, the New South Wales government itself came up with a regional housing task force. It looked into particular areas, but Kim's own research that he did for Shelter revealed to Gary Fielding, who was the convener of that particular task force, that areas, so for those of you in New South Wales, areas like Cessnock, for example, not traditionally an area that housing affordability or availability would otherwise be an issue, but because of the constant push from Newcastle and then to Maitland as you move further west, Kim's research for us revealed very much that Cessnock was now one of those LGAs that was very much having low vacancies and unaffordable housing increasingly. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Kim Houghton to the rostrum.
Thanks, John. I'd also like to note that we are meeting on land which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I live in Canberra and I really have a lot of respect for the Ngunnawal and Yambri people who've kept their culture and this environment working so relatively well for us despite colonisation, and we benefit a great deal from all of their long-standing commitment and tenacity. And I just wanted to say, Lisa, you mentioned again listening, and what really, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I get deeply humbled as a white fellow who's not really been around this country for, but this notion that Aboriginal people are still wanting us to listen to their stories. It's a big responsibility on us to do that, and I think not just listening, but really to take those learnings, to take those needs, and to shape our responses, to shape our policies around that knowledge is incredibly important, particularly in this field as well. I'm going to talk probably way too fast. I've got a fair bit, and it's quite a dense presentation, but we will make it available around afterwards. But please feel free to take photos and take notes. I do feel a bit out of place here. These people are all much more practical. I'm the impractical person here. I'm the number nerd. My favourite definition of an economist is someone who didn't quite have the personality to make it as an accountant. I'm on the economic side, but if you think about it, that reflects quite well on both sides, actually. But I do have a tendency to talk fast because I get quite excited about some of this stuff. And I'm glad that John's actually used some of the data. So they're the practical people. I'm just going to give you a bit of context as to how and why this situation has evolved and lead to what we might do about it. And we'll try and keep to time. When we look a little bit historically, we've had about 10 to 15 years of underinvestment in housing across the board in regional Australia. That's very clear. Population growth has generally been tracking higher than levels of building approvals, for instance, for quite long periods. We see many different kinds of housing markets. There are 5 regional housing markets we identified in some work we published a couple of months ago. And I'd love to talk about those if you've got any questions about those after. Broadly, you've got the high growth regions have been lacking supply in housing, again, continuing sort of underinvestment. The inland regions, not so much lacking land supply, but finance. That's a critical structural issue, which we haven't touched on yet. It's a housing one rather than a homeless one, but really happy to talk about that. Also wanted to be a little bit sort of controversial perhaps. There's been we've had discussion there already today about Airbnb and the short-term rentals. One of the highlights out of the census figures was a million unoccupied homes in this census. That's, it is a challenge, there's no doubt about that, but it's actually not much worse than it was 5 years ago or 5 years before that. So in the 5 years between the two censuses, the number of those unoccupied homes has gone up by just 4,000, from just under 1 million to just over 1 million, whereas the number of total dwellings in Australia has gone up by another 1 million. So it's actually shrunk in terms of its proportion. The unoccupied homes are now a smaller proportion of all dwellings than they were. It's still an issue, right, but it's not a new one. And I think we jump quickly to looking at changes in social media and changes in short-term rentals. There's something else going on underneath that we need to understand as well. And for us, under-occupancy is just as big a concern, particularly in our smaller towns. I look longingly at these large homes on large lots that are just on the periphery of the CBD of a small town, generally occupied by an older woman, women outliving men, men and children having either passed away or grown up and left. So you've got these lovely large homes and lovely large lots being seriously under-occupied. What's holding that back? What we're looking for here is a little more medium density, even in our smaller towns. Now, this is hugely controversial when you stand up in a council meeting and do it. That NIMBY stuff is really, really strong in small towns. But we find that the overwhelming demand for housing, not the overwhelming, but about half the demand for housing in our smaller communities is for what we call medium density, not high-rise stuff, 1 or 2 bedroom units. We did a very detailed study of 22 Western Queensland councils last year. Half the demand, half the unmet need for housing was in 1 or 2 bedroom units. This is in places of 300 or 400 or 500 people. Half the demand was for 1 or 2 bedroom units. Who wants a 1 or 2 bedroom unit in a town of 500 people? Surely everybody wants a large home on a large lot. It's not true. There are 2 key markets. One is the young folks who are passing through those communities providing professional services. They don't necessarily want a large home on a large lot. And the other group, which the locals will acknowledge if you poke them hard enough, is that there's nowhere for people to downsize to. So the only way to really get around this NIMBY thing is when the people who are holding the placards up protesting outside council, when their parents are unable to find somewhere to downside to, suddenly the situation changes. Nobody necessarily wants to live next door to a 1 or 2 bedroom unit, but for heaven's sake, it's in the community's interest to try to have a bit of compromise here and create a different kind of housing mix. I think this is a really important part of the housing spectrum. because those 1 or 2 bedroom units are at a much lower price point, either for rent or for purchase. And that's what's been missing from our high growth pattern around regional Australia. COVID has changed movement patterns. We've touched on some of this already this morning. I want to give you some data. We publish this quarterly. We have a great working partnership with the Commonwealth Bank. So this is where their customers are moving to. We can't track each and every one of you. It's all highly confidentialised and we only get to see the aggregates. But broadly, we look at where the customers are moving. Now this data till this coming quarter has just been around. We've been trying to track where people from cities have been moving to in regional places. The next quarter, the June quarter, we're actually releasing some data now on how regional people are moving from one regional place to another. So this is really focused on city to region at the moment, but it's quite interesting. That top line is flows from, the top dark line is flows from greater capitals to regions. And you can see that the COVID sort of area has seen a kick up in the flows out from capitals to regions. Regions were a safe haven, they're very popular. Look at the bottom line though. This is just as significant until the last quarter. The bottom line is people who normally move from regions to capitals. There's always a two-way flow. Now the flow out from capitals went up, but look here, the flow from regions went down and went down quite significantly in those early phases. That's what's led to the housing squeeze, because that means people were not leaving regions, putting up their houses for rent and putting up their houses for sale. Core logic, the housing data people tell us that the average stock on market for regions is about 43% below the long-term average. We have not had much supply coming onto the market for purchase, let alone for rental. And that's largely because people were staying put. They knew they were onto a good thing. Interesting thing, just in the last quarter, March 22, that started to kick up again and it's trending back towards normal. That is about the only thing in the short term that's going to influence housing availability in regions. Because if people start to move back, as they normally do, from regions to capitals, that will free up a small number of properties for rent and for purchase, much quicker than we can build. As you've all said, it's a really tight, the projections on building are really wrong. Oh, goodness me, I'm going way too slow. Sorry. This is really interesting for us too. So this is where city people are moving to. What we've seen, this is a really, I think, probably the most important thing for you guys. Over the sort of year, 18 months, we've been tracking this, where people, so these are the growth areas. So generally people move from cities, largest numbers go to the largest regional places. That's not particularly interesting. What's interesting for us is the smaller places that have seen a big growth in the number of people coming from a city. Each quarter, those places have got further and further inland. It's been just extraordinary. They started on the coast, people heading up for Byron and Surf Coast. Quarter by quarter, those places got full, more expensive, so the people vote with their feet, moving further and further inland. So 3 of our top 5 places in the last quarter are in South Australia, which had on average, the lowest median house price across the country in regional South Australia at the time. We've had people moving to Port Augusta, significant increases, people from cities to Port Augusta, Mount Gambier and Ceduna. Now, who goes to Ceduna? Nobody's been going to Ceduna for 20 years, really. It's been very, very flat in terms of population. But it's seen 114% growth. They're small numbers, right? So maybe you've got to get at least 100 to be on this list. So relatively small numbers, but a sizable increase for a really small place. That's going to really change, put a lot of pressure on a place that's completely unprepared for this sort of population growth. The flip side of these high rates of home ownership in regions is that they're really thin and underdeveloped rental markets. 20% of the total housing stock in regional New South Wales is for rent, whereas 40% in the city. Regional rental markets, we know, are highly vulnerable to shocks, fires, floods and the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll give you some examples, and we've seen a couple already, so I won't dwell on these, of some small, medium and larger markets. This comes from SQM research, still publicly available, very easy to get a hold of for any particular local government area. The bars are the number of rentals available, and the line is the share of rental vacancy. Starting with the big place on the left, Gold Coast, you can see hanging in there at about 12 to 15% sort of vacancy for a long time, then really dropping through COVID down to a much lower vacancy rate, but still sort of above 2%. What I love down the bottom is this is the annual 12-month change in rental prices in the Gold Coast. Fairly stable, suddenly kicks up. So there's a market that's working, right? This is a large market. Large markets work a lot better than small markets. You can see these other 2 smaller markets are much more volatile. Again, real decreases in the last 18 months in terms of stock availability and corresponding decreases in rental vacancy rates, as others have said, well below 1% in regional Victoria and well below 1% in around 2% in Narrabri. but quite volatile, right? So you can see that the price increases in Wangaratta have peaked. They're coming down again now, whereas Narrabri also peaked quite recently and come down, but again, much more volatile. So these markets really they fluctuate because there's so little movement, there's so little headroom in those markets. They really do fluctuate quite significantly. Last down the bottom here, low rates of public housing stock in regional New South Wales. So we at the Institute, as someone said, if you're in the market, if you own a property, the house price story really is a regional story. Over the 2 years from April 20 to April 2022, which is that main COVID spike period in house prices, regional house prices on average went up 41%, capitals went up 21%. So it really is a regional house price growth story. If you're in the market, happy days. Typically about a third of people are mortgaged, about a third own outright, and about a third are buying. So of that, pretty much half the population are either owning outright or got a very old mortgage. So happy days, 40%. Mind you, 40% average means 20% growth in a lot of places, which until recently would have been phenomenal, is actually low. We've seen a lot of places with 60% plus growth in prices over that period, just crazy and completely unsustainable. The rate rises have put an end to that and will continue to do so, which is good news for the rest of us. So those house price growth has been really much a regional story. This is the work we did for John. Many of Shelter New South Wales has a target of about 5% of the stock being public housing. There was only 5 of the larger regional New South Wales LGAs that had that. All areas of really high need. On the other measures that we did, this is just one measure, all areas of very high need. So you could easily argue that an area of high need, 5% is way too low, right? Others have talked about this too. We've really got to understand the variations by place. And just down the bottom here, looking at Birmingham for the Com Games, we let this happen. We let 5% be an ambitious target for Shelter New South Wales. What sort of community are we? In the UK, with a much stronger and more historical basis, same democratic structure, same economic structure, 15 to 17% is quite typical for public housing in the UK. That's come down from 20 to 30% a couple of decades ago. They're still sitting at 15. We're thinking of 5 as great. This is what we collectively have agreed to. These are choices that we've made. This is not something that's been bestowed upon us. We are, as a community, apparently happy that up to 5% of the stock of housing is public is acceptable. It's not acceptable. It's nuts. I don't know how we got to this point. 15% in Birmingham, very common for a large European city, that long history of council ownership and of public and affordable housing. We just choose not to do that. This is the last one, just a couple of implications. Regional populations are moving. Well, I've concentrated really on the cities to regions, but this next time we'll see region to region. Long-term residents are being displaced by natural disasters, but also by financial disaster. I don't want to over-egg it, but these signs of people of the growth rates moving inland are signs, I think, of economic refugees, people who can no longer afford to live in the places where they've grown up. There's work all over the place, as many other people have talked about. It's more this displacement of the sheer cost of housing. We've seen that happen post-natural disaster, where people can't afford to stay because the rebuilding cost is above their incomes. For us at the Institute, it's the people most affected that we need to be most concerned about are those relying on low-cost rentals. Lots of new builds are needed. We've talked about this before. And for us, really, a much better mix, a much more diverse mix, a lot more 1 or 2 bedroom units. The market is not providing that stuff. The demand is clearly there. There are some structural and also sort of investment and business-related problems that are impeding on that market to build those units where they're needed. We must rethink now how Australia does public, social and affordable housing in regions. The market has not delivered and will not deliver what's needed. We don't want metro market failures transposed to the regions. The regions have been a haven. They have been a sort of relatively sustainable, low cost of living, low income kind of haven for a lot of people. That's really got a big boot in the last 18 months and people have been displaced. There's increasingly fewer and fewer places for those people to go to, and they're not expecting that any sort of increase in flow. So those social services will be incredibly stretched. So we really do need to rethink how we resource and how we support social and affordable housing in regional Australia.
Thank you very much, Kim. I think you've single-handedly, one of the other things we often say about economists is that they are been invented to make weather forecasters look credible. I actually think that you've turned that on its head and made us realise one of the opening comments about this conference, which I picked up on yesterday, and sometimes our sector, particularly the overt homelessness sector, is not known for this, but the use of evidence-based data, rigour, figures, facts, numbers. It really does. All of you have presented facts and figures that I think we might not have seen so much in previous conferences, but it absolutely adds weight to our argument. And yours in particular there, Kim, about 5% in fact is a very low target. A number of people in the room would be realising that we're even lucky to get to 5% in some jurisdictions. All right, we've got about 15 more minutes for questions, and I really encourage you to ask questions. Those of you online as well, I hope you're enjoying it as much as we certainly are here in the room. I'll just check with Tom if there's none. So over to the floor here. Please, any questions at all of any and or all of our panel, and just some quick questions if that's okay. Thank you. We've got one up in the top corner. And just state where you're from if that's okay.
I'm from Lismore, out of a flood zone, where we had a housing crisis prior to the flood. We now have a housing catastrophe,
Yes.
which is not being addressed sufficiently, and it's going to take us a decade to get over it. My question is, how do you feel about mandated development or mandated planning from the Commonwealth down to the states to local government, where every development has to have 25% affordable housing, 25% social housing, and 50% market housing? Will that assist?
I'm going to throw that to the panel because I think you've got a unanimous yes from me, and I'm certainly a number of other people in the room would agree with you furiously, so thank you. Who on the panel would like to take that question and comment about? I mean, that's a great ideal. That's the theory. That's what we should aim for, the gold standard. Who on the Kim or anyone would like to make a comment about possibly the practical implications of such a mandate?
I trip up on the practicalities. I think it's a really good plan. It's a really good ambition to have. There's a lot of practicalities. Federal government hates to intervene, and the states will resist, and then you've got the sort of the local neighbourhood stuff as well. I think it's really important to try to change the system. We have relied way too much on the market sort of stepping in, and we've been tinkering around the edges a bit, so it may be that something big and bold is necessary. But what the smaller scale regional builders will say, it's not just that permission to build, it's the actual financial viability. And for them, once you go inland a little bit, there's plenty of land available. What they worry about is the land isn't serviced. So we talked about Nivic earlier on. Somebody needs to put the curbs and guttering and the sewer in there. The developers can't afford to do that, and often the councils can't. And where the councils do, they can. So it's about understanding some of those commercial barriers as well, I think, to encourage some of that building in places that really haven't seen building for a decade or so.
Lisa, I know, has got a comment.
It's worked in Denmark, works in Sweden. What we are talking about is greed and nothing else. We're also talking about apartheid, those who can, those who can't.
Yeah.
And we need to actually, as a community, stand up and be loud and shout it out and make sure it gets done. We have councils who are incompetent across the state of New South Wales who block decent housing, and they block social and affordable housing developments. So I think if we do something out of this conference, we put some pressure on the state and federal governments.
Thank you. Lisa, and I think you're absolutely right. I think we all agree that one of the things that Kim commented earlier is that we're in danger of seeing that the sins of the city being revisited on the regions if we don't act quickly in that regard, that inequities that exist in metro settings are amplified and exacerbated in regional settings. So, Lisa.
I just wanted to respond to what you said, and I think that it's a perfect opportunity as a result of the catastrophe that's happened in the Northern Rivers to be able to get the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation, which is, and to co-opt that body to be able to look at Commonwealth, state, local collaboration, cooperation, to be able to approach every advocacy body that you can. Certainly ACHIA New South Wales is actually working with all 14 Aboriginal community housing providers that have been affected by the Northern Rivers, because you're absolutely right, we need to see some significant change. And if it could happen in Queensland when Grantham got flooded and they created Upper Grantham and moved half the town there, and then when it next flooded, the people that stayed in Grantham proper got flooded again, but the people who'd moved to Upper Grantham changed it. If it happened in Christchurch in New Zealand, and that's exactly what happened, they didn't rebuild in the centre of Christchurch again because they took a radical view about how we needed to revision this city or this urban centre. This can happen in the Northern Rivers, and I would encourage you to take your concerns and to be able to lobby every single element of the system that you can, as patchwork as we are, to be able to get and effect a solution that's good for the community into the future.
Thank you. Another question, just before we do, Trudi or Adam, any comments on that particular one about the compunction to have certain percentages dedicated?
Oh, look, absolutely. And, I'd say in the state of Victoria, that's certainly something that Homes Vic tried to do in terms of the SAC, which is the tax that did not get through.
That's
and
right.
Every single housing development did absolutely need to have that. And certainly the inclusionary zoning would allow for more money and more investment into housing beyond the big housing build investment. Unfortunately, our developer friends didn't like that, and there was a lot of controversy, and it got dumped within 2 days of it being announced. And the Premier's gone on record saying that that's not something he will raise in the current election cycle. So, yeah, absolutely agree with you. Currently within the big housing build, it's very much encouraging local governments to play a role in this. We're of the view that a lot of this money's already been spent, and we're not sure how much has been delivered in terms of relationship with local councils. So there's a lot of rhetoric. We just need the reality, and I absolutely agree with everything you said.
Adam, anything final? We'll take another question.
Very well, truly covered there, John.
Good. We've just got another question from up the back, and I'll just double check. And again, anyone online in the last few minutes, please ask us a question. We're here to keep you informed as well.
Thank you everyone so far for your comments. My name's Amy. I live in Canberra, but I am a Bendigo born and bred person. I think my question is for Kim, but I'm keen to hear everybody's thoughts. I appreciate that all of you had some fantastic data and numbers and information. My question is, how can we better use the data that we have to inform service delivery moving forward? And how can we, I guess, include qualitative data in? Is that something that you do? And how could we do that?
Thank you for your question. Who would like to answer that first? I'm looking at any or all of you, but Kim, you're well placed to answer this one, I'm sure.
Look, I mean, it's data alone really changes people's minds. I'm passionate about numbers, but they don't tell the whole story. So those qualitative stories are really important for getting political buy-in. In fact, those qualitative stories tend to have more political power, I think, than the big numbers. The other thing is that while the data itself is a bit rubbery sometimes when you go down to the small scale, it really is important to get sort of place-based solutions to some of these challenges. What we need, I think, fundamentally is not so much just more analysis. It's trying to sort of create an environment where that information is accepted. There's a lot of resistance, and so you'll see that government agencies, left, right and centre, will studiously ignore the numbers and the data that they don't want to have. So it's about, I think it's as much about building that sort of, the independence, those sort of regional independence that we've had in Victoria, building that sort of community support for radical change, I think is just as important as getting the data story right. Because without that, it's too easy to ignore, unfortunately.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on the quality stories that back up the political will and the stats and the figures that we need?
Say that it's what you do with that data yourself in an organisation that determines, your future. And I think if we continually wait for governments to catch up to the data and the actual anecdotal evidence, then it's gone too far. So in our organisation, we're looking at how do we provide more outcome-based requirements to our operating model. So we're changing everything up, and because we can't wait for government, so we're like, okay, how do we get best use of the money in which we have? We know there's not a lot more on offer, so how do we change and evolve and work better with our partners to create greater outcomes for the people we serve? not what we're waiting for government to deliver upon.
Thanks, Judy. Adam, or, sorry, Liz.
Yeah, I tend to agree there, and I think it's really important that that we do put good news stories forward. It's extremely important. I know when H to H first started, it was all about data report, and data. To a kind of point, you're popping Panadol. It was an absolute, it was a nightmare. But there was really no interest in good news stories, and outcomes are so important. And one of the things that we're doing in our entry point in Ballarat and up in Houghton is, we put the data there. They know how many people are coming through our doors. But what we're starting to do now is we're actually starting to calculate that and record that unmet demand. So the people that we're just not getting to, because that doesn't get to the government in our monthly reporting. So we're actually keeping that and submitting it separately. So they know, for years now, we've seen 1,900 people. We're targeted to 1,200 over a year. So it's about staff retention and looking after our staff. And that's the other side of things here. Looking after your staff, we can't keep up. But we just kept doing the work. So now we've actually started to strip it right back. We're sticking to what targets are. We're looking after our staff. There's no burnout. We're submitting what the unmet demand is. And maybe they'll get the message and start, resourcing our programs properly.
Thank you. Lisa, just finally, and then we'll take another question. Anything from you about that?
Well, I think data is great and presenting unmet need, but how do we do that? We need to present a narrative blueprint, because it's all very well to present numbers, but these numbers are plot points. How do we join those dots? How do we join them in the minds and enjoy in people's hearts in order to create a forward trajectory in terms of what our solutions are? Those are the things that we need to consider in terms of how we're presenting those stories and where do they lead in terms of enjoining people to join us in that journey, to fund that journey, to invest in that journey so that we can push forward to those solutions.
Thank you. Couple more minutes, please. Oh, Narelle, is that right?
I come from Wollongong, Shellharbour, which were on King's Sly, so I'm proud to live in the regions and always have. Great Canada, by the way. Kim, it's not usual that people like me love economists. I think I did sort of, warm up to you instantly. And I think the way you presented some of that was incredible. I think there is, we've been saying for a while that you actually were able to much more succinctly say it. What I'm interested in is, well, you asked a question, I'm going to answer it for you. Yeah, you asked, how did we get here? We got here because government started telling us bullshit, which is, it's not about books and water. Public housing are bad places, and the private market can deliver. They are 3 myths that were perpetrated by government. Now, we fought that a bit, but we got worn out, and people got very caught up in the conservatism of it, and bullshit about how we do this. So I thank you for asking the question. I thank you for what you said. I'm interested in what you think. And it's not usual for advocates like me to ask you as an economist how we can better advocate, but how do we beat some of that myth? Because although in some states and territories we moved on a little bit in the government, and there were some good talks yesterday, but what else can advocates do to get that message heard? Yes, we can use data, yes, we can tell stories, but have you got advice for us?
I think just call it out as you've done, as a series of myths which has been perpetuated for a particular and very narrow set of sort of economic and political principles. So that notion that the market can somehow address market failures is nonsense. And that, I guess what I'm trying to get at is those, if you want to sort of make the point that we need to sort of really sort of, I don't want to get sort of too esoteric about it, but it's basically sort of the convenience of sort of neoclassical economics, which has allowed us to sort of seduce ourselves into thinking that if we tinker with the market enough, it will provide a solution. Subsidised housing will not happen without a subsidy. And the great, and I know this is overused, government really stepped in and we had a lot more sort of social and public spending over the last couple of years. It can be done if the will is there. We need that same will, and we need community support to recognise that supported housing needs public taxpayer support. We've let it become a dirty word. We've let ourselves be seduced by the idea that taxpayers actually shouldn't have to pay because the market can be twisted. It won't. It never has, and it never will. So keep calling it out. and keep championing the fact that, subsidised and affordable housing will need a public subsidy. There's no two ways about it. So just swallow that and then move on to the how.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Narelle. Look, we're just finishing up now. One question from online. I'm always keen to make sure that we give the people online in these hybrid things the opportunity. So Philippa Boldly has pointed out that our session hasn't made express reference to Northern Territory or Western Australia. We haven't. We've focused particularly on Victoria, and in fact, two complementary but very close areas to point to a particular area to contrast them. There have been other sessions at this conference, I know, that focus on the Northern Territory. One of my colleagues from Northern Territory Shelter, Peter McMillan's focused specifically on that. And I'm pretty sure there's another session around that's also going to talk about Western Australia. So apologies for not being able to be comprehensive about the whole country, but I dare say that